All right, AP Euro, time to finish our lecture that we started in class yesterday about the Enlightenment. So remember, we're connecting this both to the Renaissance and the Scientific Revolution, an intellectual movement that is moving through Europe, where the old ways, the ways of the Middle Ages and maybe even previous to that, where God was at the center of all things, is being replaced with man at the center. Man using his intellect, his rational thought, which is all of them would have believed was God-given. But man, through his ability to reason, can find the truths of the universe, right, which we demonstrated through the scientific revolution, the creation of the scientific method, which is the basis still even today for inquiry and finding new discoveries in nature. And so the Enlightenment is taking that same principle and applying it to human society. And so we're looking at this in relationship to governments, in relationship to other types of social questions, be it torture, capital punishment, the roles of women, and the like. And remember that this is an undercurrent that goes throughout European history. We'll see is this idea of progress, that societies are improving constantly and taking steps and leaps forward, at least as we'll see until the earliest 20th century. So yesterday we talked about the basis for the Enlightenment. We talked about the salons in Paris, and we introduced Voltaire as kind of the prototypical and most important of the philosophes, a prolific writer of letters and of books. And remember that really writings is the primary vehicle, right? What's going to move information from one part of Europe and the continent to the next is going to be writings and the availability of those writings. And so the salon is just one method where people can kind of put forth new ideas, but then they're written down in books or pamphlet form and then spread through bookstores and other means. So Voltaire, as we said, vociferous writer, believer in free speech. As we said yesterday, constitutional government, a limited monarchy. All right, so the guy you see on the screen here, this is Baron de Montesquieu. He was a French nobleman and was keenly interested in finding the best form of government. And in a true kind of enlightened, or we might say proponent of the scientific method, he went to discover the question is, what is the best type of government? And he realized that governments change based upon the situation, the time period, and the population of particular countries. And so he looked throughout history and looked at examples of governments. He pointed out the strengths of those governments, or at least his perceived strengths or weaknesses. And then he kind of made his conclusions. This was all done in his most important book. Again, an example of writing. It was called The Spirit of Laws. And he looked at his own time period and praised the English system, which, again, this is the post-Glorious Revolution English system where Parliament is ascendant, where the power of the monarchy is limited, right? And he called this idea a separation of powers, that no one individual or no one mechanism of the state was all-powerful. Right? Parliament was not all-powerful because the king was there to check his authority, because the king controlled certain things that Parliament could not. And the judiciary was even separate from that. And so from that, this idea is that if you separate the powers of a government into legislative, executive, and judicial, it creates a system whereby despotism, which they mean by that arbitrary government, tyrannical government, can be checked, can be limited, because no one entity has power, total power. And these branches of government are constantly in conflict with each other. And of course, we see this in our politics today. Sometimes people say, well, our politics is broken. Well, not necessarily, right? That there is supposed to be some conflict between the different branches. And ultimately, this conflict and this jealousy of power between the branches is what protects the liberty of the citizens, because the branches are not ganging up on each other to take away liberties. So Montesquieu, is the one that kind of points this out. Highly influential to later American readers, and particularly James Madison, as he is proposing ideas for the new Constitution for the United States. This idea of separation of powers will be vital to the founders' understanding of what would be a government that is going to sorry to stop. There is randomly a dog at the back porch, and he just walked away. And we have our door open, and he walked up to the deck and has now walked back away. Our cat saw him and was not very pleased by that. That was a very strange moment there. But I'm back, and we can finish this about Montesquieu. All right, so Montesquieu is a nobleman. His name is, the Baron de Montesquieu. That's his title, and what he's known as. So he's conservative as far as his belief in society. He believes that there is very definite roles for women and men that are separate. He believes women should be in a subservient role in society, and this is, true of his noble birth. But as it says, he is a proponent of a monarchy that is limited in its scope, right? So a constitutional monarchy. And again, remember, both he and Voltaire are French. They're living in a country with an absolute monarch, but both of them advocating a limit to the power of the crown, not expansion of it. And so it could be seen as highly controversial. But the Baron de Montesquieu, because of his conservatism in other areas and his relative obscurity from the court, meant that he was able to write and work in relative peace and stability, to not have to worry about any harassment from the crown. We're going to move on to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. These three guys, Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu, are kind of the three giants of the French Enlightenment, the three most important philosophes. They're all quite different. Voltaire was from a very we might call him middle class, but his family was still very well to do. Montesquieu was a nobleman. Rousseau was the lowest of the births of all of them. He would have been from the lower middle class, not peasantry, but lower middle class. And he's actually not French by birth. He was born in Switzerland, but of French descent, and spent most of his time in France. Rousseau is also the most controversial of all the philosophes, because his ideas were, both controversial in his own day, but also kind of vague. Like Locke and like Hobbes, he talked about the social contract, and that society was built around this idea that the people themselves were sovereign, and that they had agreed to leave a state of nature and to come back and be governed in some way. And so we talk about this through the idea of the social contract. However, as we said, his ideas are quite controversial because of where he took it. He did not talk about that people should vote and that every vote should count equally and things like that. Instead, he talked about that people should put their individuality aside, their individual interests, and that the individual, what he called the general will, should prevail, that there is some general goodness that society can glom onto, and people should put aside their individual interests, their individual wants, and they should become subservient to the general will. He never talks about how this general will is decided. He doesn't say if this is a democratic vote. He doesn't say if this is something that is decided by a absolute dictator or what. But because of this, his ideas were utilized by lots of groups that would proclaim absolute power and to represent the will of the people. We will see this pop up throughout the rest of European history, certainly in the French Revolution, during the radical stages of the French Revolution and the virtual dictatorship by the Committee of Public Safety, which we'll talk about a little bit later, as well as leaders of other popular movements, the revolutions of 1848, as well as all the way into the 20th century and the uprisings in Russia and the Bolsheviks, who eventually will overthrow the Russian state and establish the Soviet Union. They kind of follow this idea of that they represent the will of the people. And so while we might say, yes, Rousseau is more democratic because he rejects monarchy and rejects kind of traditional order, right? He doesn't say, he's not a true Democrat. He doesn't say that, how this power should be distributed. Is it done by votes? Is it done by just one person making the decisions? Beyond that, his answer to the question of the rights of women is that they're separate spheres. Women have their sphere where they can be dominant. Men have their sphere, and those two spheres do not intertwine with each other. And so he does not advocate for the equal treatment of women in society. And this idea of blaming the evil in the world and the unequal distribution of property, who gets to decide how property is distributed, all those types of questions. You can see how, especially when we get to communist movements of the 20th century, how they could kind of take these ideas of Rousseau and run with them. So he's very controversial, but very much a free thinker. And probably after Voltaire, he is the most important of the French philosophes because of his influence. And then the last one, we're going to talk about Romanticism as we move into the 19th century. But he is not governed by pure reason, right, which most of the philosophes are, right? This period is called the Age of Reason. But Rousseau, in many ways, kind of rejects pure reason for listening to emotions, the power of nature, man's place within nature, things like that he writes a lot about. All right, and so his, we say, democracy, but remember, this is not a democracy as we think of it in the 21st century, but something entirely different. Really, it just means majoritarian, right? That the will of the majority supersedes our own desires, and our own desires should be second to the will of the majority, which, again, we live in a governmental system that does not work that way. We'll talk more about that, as we said, later. All right, economic philosophy. This is an important one. All right, so economic philosophy is going to take a huge leap forward, and we're going to reject the principles of mercantilism in favor of something new, which eventually we will call capitalism. This begins in the mid-18th century, the mid-1700s in France, where there is a group of economists who are rejecting the traditional mercantilist theories that had been so prevalent really since the days of Louis XIV, and they begin to advocate for a new way of collecting wealth of the country. The biggest thing that they advocate, and this is primarily in the agricultural sphere, is that the state, which in the mercantilist philosophy, the state is the ultimate arbiter and controller of the economic system. And so the state can control property, the state can have monopolistic control of the colonies, of trade. And these individuals that we call the physiocrats, they are rejecting these ideas. And they say instead that the government should have less of a role in economic activity, and that economic activity without governmental control, without governmental regulation, will actually increase its strength over time. And so these new guys are going to advocate instead of strict control and regulation of trade, which is what we see in mercantilist states, we will see an advocation of free trade, right? Open the trade of goods from colonies and with your own country open to the market. Let the market dictate the price, and it will actually increase prices and increase opportunity. And then secondly, the government should, again, take less of a role. The government's role should be very limited to these things. Number one is to protect private property, right? You do this through law and order, right? Make sure that there is a good system of order and respect for property and property rights done through the law in the state. And then you maintain armies to protect the state from invasion. All right, allow owners to use their land to prosper in any way they see fit, and someone acting in their own self-interest will improve it in the way they see fit. And so by not putting a strict control over what people can do with their land, they are going to be able to take the opportunity to improve it. And this is actually going to increase the value of property. It will increase the economic yield. Either we're using it for farming, to build factories, for pasture land, whatever. But let the owner make the decision. Let them improve it. And that will increase the value, not only of the land, but it's going to increase the economic output of the land over time. So again, Francois Quesnay, a guy named Turgot, who was a important thinker of the late 18th century, and then Pierre Dupont, who are all what we call physiocrats. Now, these ideas are going to be picked up by the Scottish professor and philosopher Adam Smith, and kind of further expounded into a much more cohesive, what we might call economic system. And this is Adam Smith, who in 1776 publishes his seminal work, which is called The Wealth of Nations. Right? It is the basis of what we call classical economics. It is the basis for system of commerce of capitalism that we use today. All right, again, advocates free trade. Right, we should the state's controls regulation, the state putting up barriers to trade through tariffs. All of this actually lowers and shackles economic activity. If you remove these, it's going to allow the market to grow and to prosper. All right, and so both the physiocrats and Adam Smith advocates this French term, which we call laissez-faire. It's a term we'll use a lot from here on out. But it translates to let it be, or hands off. And so the government does not strictly control trade, does not strictly control the market. Let the market work freely, and this will actually improve the market in all ways. And for those of you who have taken economics, we've talked a lot about this, right? How the market can dictate prices, how the market will lead to a division of labor, to job specialization. All of these things are going to increase economic activity, increase technologies, is going to increase efficiency, right, as people are trying to maximize their own profit potential. In essence, right, each person acting in their own self-interest is actually going to benefit society as a whole, rather than the government telling people what to do. All right. So it challenges the belief that resources were limited and scarce. Now, obviously, we know resources are limited and scarce, but by advocating a free flow of decision-making on how those resources are used, right, we create more efficient uses for them, right? Labor can be distributed more efficiently. Technology can be used to maximize the potential of these limited resources. And it's just going to increase economic activity, and ultimately that will increase productivity. And as this happens, it will benefit society as a whole. So it's really a kind of revolutionary idea. Again, he is studying the market, studying activity from the past, and he's advocating these new ideas, right? And this is what we call the beginning of classical economics, which is really the dominant economic theory for the next 200 years or so. And really, we're still living in a capitalist society, which is built on the foundations that Adam Smith discussed during this time. He called this the invisible hand. That's the the laws of supply and demand, which control the market, right? He advocated this idea of what he calls the four-stage theory of commerce or of economy, that that there is a natural development of society, and that we're in the final stage, which he calls the age of commerce. Later, Karl Marx would come along and challenge this and say that there's actually a next step of development, which is called communism, but that's a discussion for another day and is not a discussion of the Enlightenment. So again, looking at something like economics, challenging the established position and putting forth a new one based upon reason and observation. That's what Adam Smith is doing. Now, this does not mean that his theories are going to be put into place right away. It will really not be until the early 19th century in Europe, maybe the late 18th century in the United States, that we begin to see his economic theories put into practice. But they will be highly influential as we move into the 19th century in Europe. Then finally, as we've talked about, there's a lot of different views of religion in society. Right, the biggest thing we got to take away is the idea of religious toleration. Right, that's respect for all religions, and then, as we've talked about, the idea of deism. We'll talk about that in a second. This is Mary Wollstonecraft. She is probably the most important proponent of women's rights in the Enlightenment, kind of an early icon of what we might call the feminist movement for pushing for equal rights of women. As we'll see, most of these philosophers are going to be very traditional in their views of women's roles, right? Should not surprise us that Montesquieu is, right? He believes that they are equal in a biological sense, but he still says that they should, right, for the order of society, that women and men should respect traditional roles. We did not talk about Diderot. He probably created the most important published work of the Enlightenment, called the Encyclopedia, which was supposed to be a basis for all knowledge. It had several volumes. They had articles about all types of things: slavery, how to build a steam engine, what's the most efficient use of artillery, how to grow crops. Everything was covered in the encyclopedia and looked at from a fresh, either scientific or enlightened view of either society or nature. And again, they weren't afraid to discuss controversial issues, including the roles of women in society. And there were articles written about ways that women's lives could be improved, be it education, be it opportunities to read, things like that. But there's no suggestion of reform, either property rights or university classes to women being in the workplace, right? Nothing like that was actually suggested, other than how their private life could be improved. We talked about Rousseau, right? That women should be subordinate to men. He wrote this multiple times in his works. And then we get to Mary Wollstonecraft herself. So notice the year of the publishing of this, 1792. This is at the tail end of what we might call the Enlightenment during the French Revolution. She is British, and she writes what's called the Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And this is written as a answer to what we call the Vindication of the Rights of Man, which had been written during the early days of the French Revolution. And so her writings said that, as you see, if women had access to the same educational opportunities as men, they would be equally as intelligent. Right? There was no, biological difference between them. There was only social constraints that were placed upon women, and that if you removed these social constraints, they could achieve just as much intellectually as men could. Right? And this is, again, a very major stepping stone to what we call first wave feminism, right? And bringing women into equal access and equal economic and social opportunities. So a watershed moment and an important moment that begins here with the Enlightenment. All right, there's a lot more that you can discuss. I encourage you again to read the section in your AMSCO book about the Enlightenment 4.3 as we move forward. So once you finish this video, make sure you take your notes. I will post another one later that will talk about the principle of enlightened absolutism. I will join you then. Thanks for watching. See you soon.